This is Just Listen, hosted by George. Today is October 14th, 2024. Welcome to the show. Hopefully, some of you folks are off today because it is a holiday. I do know that depending on the company, they've tried to take away as many holidays as possible, right? Okay, so when I talk about U.S. government policy on presidential elections, I think that those conversations have been very constructive. And to hone in on my point of, I am informing you on things that the mass media and the streaming services just to date will not talk about. Occasionally, some things will pop up there, but they're gone almost as fast as it comes out of people's minds. So, the focus point today is, when did the presidential elections go off the rails? What do I mean by that? When did we divide the country so that people are just so partisan one way or the other? So it's not one side greater than the other one that is partisan. That's a valid point. And why are we not really getting to the root cause or problem with partisanship? Here's some things I want you to think about that are not, it is really not being talked about. Number one, and the biggest one, is why people distrust the government. Next one is good guy and bad guy syndrome as far as the presidential candidates go. And then a little known one that people really don't even think about until after the election for the president. Why are the Europeans quiet? Like I said, distrust of the government. Why is that? It's related to five or six subpoints. First one is taxes. When I talk to people and we're having conversations, the way that money is spent in this country is on everybody's mind. It doesn't matter whose side you're on. And if the government, US government, was really listening, they would listen to folks asking about why taxpayer dollars, what has been spent on, and also why the middle class is being so targeted with that. And it's almost bad to make a lot of money. And what the politicians don't realize or want to know about, to include the presidential candidates, is people have to understand why you want them to personally pay more taxes. And when you're making them pay all of these taxes, they're actually questioning your judgment, especially if they can see that things are not changing, nothing's getting better. And related to that is what the money is being spent on. So the presidential candidates are talking about one of them is what they're going to do with taxpayer dollars and how to generate or get started the economy. And it's related to the other one. If you're paying all these taxes and you can't see what it's being spent on, or you don't necessarily agree with how it's being spent, that's going to cause you not to trust the government even more. Which leads into the next ones. Politicians don't tell the truth. They get penalized, and rightly so, when they say things. And it's really gone off of the rails because that's a big part of what this podcast is about. When you pick on one side and everything that they say is just scrutinized to death. Now, that started with in 2016 election, the most recent one with Donald Trump, and the fact that he can't say or do anything that is not fact checked 5 or 6 times. The other side does it too, but there's not as much scrutiny on that whatsoever. And it's gone off the rails of just attacking. And I'll get back to this point because it leads into one of the other big bullets that I was talking about. The next one would be federal government has too much power. A lot of people think that. And what do they mean by that? That common people are being controlled by the government. Now, I'm not going to say whether I think that's true or not. You can decide that for yourself. But during the presidential election, going off of the rails, one candidate is being accused of, if they get elected, having too much power and influence. Presidents, no matter who it is, they can only do certain things. Why? As you are aware, there are checks and balances. We have the judicial, we have Congress. So to label a candidate, and normally, honestly, it's a Republican that they label that way. The last thing under the distrust of the government is economic inequality. That became popular probably in 2016 as well because they were labeling a billionaire. Did you know that most of the politicians who are running at that level are millionaires? This notion that economic inequality is tied to the presidential election doesn't make sense, except when you think about that it's a label to say that, well, this guy cannot identify with middle class people and people who are working class. And they've used it. Now, I'm going to give you some examples and see if you remember which president or presidential candidate that this was associated with. First one was Willie Horton. During the 1988 election, George Bush, the senior Bush, ran the Willie Horton ad on TV. You would see it everywhere. That was damaging to Dukakis, and when Dukakis didn't answer back, then he got labeled. So it's the good guy and the bad guy syndrome. The second Bush's military record. Remember, CBS spent most of their time when the second George Bush was running for president talking about his military record and how awful it was, and none of that was true either. On the Republican side, presidential candidates, this is a main one. Perception of racism. Since Ronald Reagan became president, after that, every Republican nominee is perceived as racist. And no one talks about the real reason why this happens on the Republican side. I think that it happens because once a candidate on the Republican side starts talking about the economy and fair taxes, there is a pivot to racism. The last one under this is when Barack Obama was running for president, probably 3 months before the election, the other side tried to label him as a Muslim to get you to be scared of the perception of Muslims. So I bring this up because both sides are doing it, and it's put presidential elections off of the rails. And all this does is make the other side, next time around, when they can find something about your candidate, to do the same thing. And when this is done, it kills the other presidential candidate's character. And like I said, prior to Ronald Reagan, it was not like that. There was lots of talk, and I've told you in other podcasts, there was substance about foreign affairs, the economy, things of that nature that were more important. And the last one is, why are the Europeans quiet about the presidential election? Remember, I said that things are going off of the rails. It's going off of the rails this time because if the Republican wins, the rest of the world knows that the money for foreign aid is going to dry up. When Trump was president the first time, he started talking to them about why the United States was paying the bulk of the bills, which is a legitimate question. Prior to Donald Trump saying it, I wasn't paying attention to it. If you go and do the research, and you should, because I've talked about it on these podcasts of how much money we're giving countries in foreign aid when, number one, they've got millionaires and billionaires in their country and they're doing fine. And the other piece of that is the people that we're giving the money to, they are not getting it, and they have governments that keep the money and use it for other things. And the biggest ones that I've seen doing that are the black African countries. Why do I say black African? Because Africa itself is a continent. So the people that are the poorest in Africa are the ones that are under these oppressive governments in these black countries. They've been poor for a century. The other Europeans are quiet because they don't necessarily agree with how President Trump would deal with our adversaries, right? And as you all know, the big one now is Iran. And they want the status quo that they had from Biden and Harris. That's why they're not saying anything, because if you go back and look in the past, they would make comments. People would say, yeah, it would be nice if this person became president. They don't say that now. Why? Because of the money. We have to get the presidential elections back on track. They are off the rails for the reasons that I just talked about. But it can not only be me talking about these issues. We, the people, need to demand more out of our journalists to ask questions and talk about the real things that would make both sides uncomfortable. This is George. Just listen. Let me know what you think.